Good morning, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be out here and speak with you. As Pete mentioned, I did a kind of a quick analysis of your reserve plan, looking at the existing component list you had, and so Pete asked me to come out and talk to you about just reserve studies in general, just to clear up any confusion. So I'm going to go over some reserve study basics, and essentially just want to introduce terminology that we use in the reserve study industry, give you an idea of how things are calculated and what the different items mean. So to start, I like to say, well, what is a reserve study anyway? But basically, it's a planning document and a budgeting model. Its purpose is to help associations prepare for significant, irregular expenses over time while minimizing and avoiding surprises and special assessments. Now, I emphasize irregular because reserve studies are planning for expenses that are occurring 5, 10, 20, 30 years out. These are not expenses that are occurring every year. It's not prudent or it's not realistic to plan for these large irregular expenses in your annual operating budget. So having a reserve study is important because asset deterioration, like we see on this beautiful building, and the expenses that come from that deterioration are inevitable. The only question is, how prepared will you be? A reserve study helps you avoid being surprised by an expense that was gradually approaching over the last 10 or 20 years. Now let's talk about some other reasons that encourage regular reserve planning. Governing documents. They typically empower and require the board to set aside and collect funds to adequately prepare for common area repair and replacement expenses. State laws. In working with clients across the country, we found there's approximately 30 states now that have some laws requiring different levels or frequency of reserve studies. Does anybody know if Arizona is one of those 30 states? Do we have a law requiring a reserve study?
We do not.
No, we don't. Does that mean you don't need one?
No.
Right. But I'd say the board has a fiduciary duty to the membership of its community. As such, I would argue that the board would not be upholding its duty if there is no reserve study at all or even a current reserve study. In that respect, a reserve study should be considered a requirement regardless of the state's position of it or lack thereof. Generally accepted accounting principles, we often refer to these as GAAP. These are standard accounting practices across all 50 states. They call for associations to annually balance the physical deterioration of the common areas with a sufficient amount of cash to ensure the association is on track to repair and replace its assets. That's basically a reserve study. And finally, there's the fundamental, practical need for information. Boards and management need a periodic status update on the association's major upcoming expenses and its ability to pay for them. That's what a reserve study helps them achieve. A reserve study can appear overwhelming if you've ever looked at one. They can be anywhere from 10 to well over 100 pages. And a property this size would probably have several hundred pages of reserve study. But regardless of the document size and all the data it contains, it all boils down to just 3 key results. First is a list of what you're reserving for. We call it a component list. This forms the foundation of your reserve study. Second is a measurement of reserve fund strength, which we refer to as percent funded. And third is a plan to prepare for the expenses on the component list, and that's your funding plan. So the first 2 results establish where you are now. And the third is a recommendation of where to go from here. So when you're looking at your reserve study, make sure you can identify those key results. And we're going to spend some time identifying those results and talking about them and how they're achieved. First, we're going to look at the component list. As I said, this forms the foundation of the reserve study. All the other results are based on the component list, so it's important that it be current and credible. Now, your reserve study or your reserve fund is not going to be a catch-all for every expense the association is going to face. Your reserve study is not going to account for every potential expense the association can or will face. So how do we know what should be included in the reserve study? The National Reserve Study Standards outlines this 4-part test to help determine whether or not an asset or an expense is appropriate for reserve funding. So first and foremost, any asset or expense that we're considering for the reserves must be a common area maintenance responsibility of the association. Any asset or expense in question, or we're considering, must have a limited useful life. And that asset or expense must have a predictable remaining life. And I extend predictability to scope of work and cost, because we need to be able to reasonably anticipate when something is going to happen and how much it's going to cost in order to incorporate it into the funding plan. And finally, cost of the asset must be above a minimum threshold cost. That means the cost should be too large to be easily absorbed into your maintenance budget. Now, we look to the board and management to help determine what is an appropriate threshold cost for your community, because it's going to vary depending on community size and budget flexibility. Most of the typical clients, typical size communities we work with, have a threshold cost in the range of $1,000 to $3,000. So to give you an example of how this threshold cost works, let's say your community has a $2,000 expense threshold. That means anything below $2,000, even if it meets the first three criteria, is considered insignificant to your community. Now, it might be listed in your reserve study, but it's not going to be funded. So if we have a $2,000 threshold and let's say we have to replace a regular pool pump for $1,500, we're not going to be funding for that in the reserve study. So this is a mechanism to help weed out those smaller, insignificant expenses to keep the reserve study focused on the more significant issues facing the community. So there's a number of assets and items that you're going to find in the reserve study, and I just want to list a few, real common assets that we see at a lot of communities, but it's really going to vary depending on the type of community and its common area responsibilities. But typically, reserve studies are going to account for asphalt, private streets, parking lots, again, assuming they're a common area and not maintained by the city. The pools and the related items such as the decks, furniture, fencing, and the equipment servicing the pools. Playground equipment, painting, could be common walls, fences, and common buildings, and roofing for common buildings. But maybe what's more interesting is what's typically not included in a reserve study. First and foremost, I talked about predictability. So items that have unpredictability in terms of life expectancy, remaining life, scope of work, and cost are generally not going to be included in a reserve study. A couple typical examples under this issue would be electrical wiring and plumbing. These are things that are in the walls, they're in the ground, we can't see them, we can't quantify them or inspect them. It's just beyond the scope of a reserve analyst to be able to provide guidance on something like this. Now that doesn't mean they can't be in the reserve study, it's just beyond us to put it in there. So let's say you have history of plumbing expenses. We can look at that history and determine, okay, we should be planning for something here. Or you've had a plumber or contractor or a landscaper saying, you've got a major expense to plan for in the next 3 to 5 years and it's going to cost X number of dollars, and you tell us this, we can plug that in. It's just beyond us to be able to provide that guidance. Assets that have extended life expectancies, such as buildings and foundations. We're not going to be budgeting to replace your common buildings. Now, the different parts of the buildings, like the roofs and flooring and things like that, will be included, but we're not going to be planning to demo the building and rebuild it. Annual expenses are inappropriate to be funded in the reserves, regardless of how expensive they are. Some communities do like, let's say, a large annual tree trimming project to be in the reserve study because it's a big expense. But as an annual expense, it doesn't matter if it's in reserves or operating. It's money in, money out. So our preference is to keep it in operating. And finally, small, insignificant expenses are inappropriate to be funded through your reserves. So here's a sample component list that's compiled after inspection of the community. Every component that we are including in the reserve study is identified with a title. It has an assigned useful life, remaining life, and current cost. So with this component list, this is what the culmination of what we would call the physical analysis portion of the reserve study. And we developed this list through a thorough inspection, on-site visual inspection of the community. Once we have this data in place, our physical analysis is complete and we can move into the financial analysis portion of the reserve study. Any questions on the component list? So to start the financial analysis, oh, yes, sir.
Is the irrigation system the same as plumbing?
Yes. So I'm kind of,
What?
This is being videotaped, not for discussion.
we can talk about that, but yes, it's considered plumbing. Give you a little bit on that. Yes, common area irrigation we don't include on our own. When I'm working with the golf course community, I always include the golf course irrigation because I have better data on that and I know what to include for it. Second part of the reserve study results is a measurement of reserve fund strength, again, which we call percent funded. Now, fortunately, this is a pretty simple concept, and I'm going to illustrate with an example of a $10,000 expense that occurs every 10 years. I've eliminated the effects of inflation to keep the illustration simple. So the question is, how much should be in the reserve fund to prepare for this recurring expense? Now, I'll give you a hint. This is a trick question. Does anybody have a guess? All right.
Nothing.
The answer is it depends. Because it depends which year you are in. In the years where we're getting closer to the actual expense occurring, your reserve fund should be growing closer to that estimated cost. Once you complete the project, you start the cycle of saving all over again. It's simply a matter of having the amount of funds on hand equivalent to the asset's deterioration. So if we're halfway through the life expectancy, we should have saved half of the replacement value of that asset by now. Now, what I've just talked about, this concept is called the fully funded balance. Now, the fully funded balance is a benchmark balance of how much the association should have in its reserve fund at a point in time. And it's calculated by multiplying the fractional age of a component by its current cost. So let's say if we're halfway through the life expectancy of an asset, the fractional age is half times the current cost. Now we apply that formula to every item, every funded component on that component list and come up with an association total. Now the fully funded balance is typically calculated and reported as of the first day of the fiscal year. This is not something that you recalculate every month. This is not something you recalculate every time you spend reserve money. I have lots of boards that attempt to do that, and I will tell you that you're not calculating it correctly by doing that. So here's another sample component list where we've showed the useful life, the remaining life, the current cost, and we've calculated the fully funded balance. So every component has a different life expectancy, has a different remaining life. These assets are not all occurring at the same time. But the result is, in this example, the association should have about $154,000 in its reserve fund to prepare for these components. So percent funded is our reserve strength indicator. It measures how well reserve funds match its needs. And this is another simple calculation. It's just the ratio of how much you actually have in your reserve funds to that fully funded balance we just calculated and talked about. And again, like the fully funded balance, this is something we calculate once per year for the start of the fiscal year. This is not something you track and update throughout the year because again, you need the fully funded balance to come up with a correct percent funded estimate. And if you're not measuring or calculating that correctly, you don't have correct percent funded estimate either. So we've divided percent funded as a measure of reserve fund strength into three ranges or categories. 0 to 30% funded is considered a poor or weak financial position. 70 to 130% funded is considered strong. And the middle area between 30 and 70% funded is considered fair. But that's kind of like a sliding scale. The closer you are to the 70% range, the better. So think of percent funded like a credit score because it measures risk. We're all familiar with the FICO score. We want to get a mortgage to buy a house, get a credit card. We all know the credit companies look at FICO score because it's a measurement of risk in lending you money. So percent funded is a measurement of risk for the community. And it's a quick evaluation of an association's financial health. So you should be able to look at that percent funded and get an image of how well is this community doing. Now this graph illustrates the relationship between percent funded and the risk of special assessments. But I want you to notice, or see, is that as percent funded along the bottom goes down, the risk of special assessment goes up. In fact, in that 0 to 30% weak range, special assessment risk averages 37%. And what that means is that any time an association is in that range, they have a better than 1 in 3 chance of needing a special assessment that year due to a lack of sufficient reserve funds. On the other end of the spectrum, you can see that special assessments are rare amongst associations that have strong reserves at 70% funded and above. Now this graph illustrates percent funded ratings for about a sample of 25,000 reserve studies we prepared over the years, just to give you an idea of where you fit in the spectrum of all the other communities, or a lot of communities around. And what we find is that most associations are in that middle fair range, but there are plenty of others in that red weak range and in the green strong range. It's a mistake to think that all associations are poorly funded and that no association could ever afford to be well funded. The entire spectrum exists. Now, if anybody's familiar with the analysis we did last year, we showed that your association's at 56% funded. So you're kind of right there in the middle with everybody else. Is that bad? Is that good? Percent funded is just, again, a risk rating at a point in time, and it's going to change every year. So being 56% funded is not bad, but we also have to look at what is your funding plan. Are you contributing enough to continue improving? Are you not contributing enough? So again, percent funded doesn't tell the whole story. And one thing I want to point out when we look at all these numbers, they're more reflective of your typical community association throughout the country. You know, condo property, maybe a small 100-unit property. It's hard to say that these numbers are going to be reflective of a large-scale community like Sun City West, right? We consider 70% funded and above to be a position of good financial strength. And I'm encouraging my business partner who crunches all this data to really dig down and focus on large-scale communities only. So we don't have the data to support it yet, but our belief is that a large-scale community in the 50% funded range is actually good. Now, we're trying to, like I said, get that data to support it, but there's so many homes and owners contributing to the reserve fund and the expenses and the upkeep of the community that you really don't have the same risk of special assessment as a regular community. You know, if you're a 100-unit community and you've got to replace the roof or repave your parking lot or street, that's a lot of financial burden on a small group of owners. Whereas here you have like 17,000 homes that can contribute to maintaining the property. So it's not as big of a financial burden or risk on a per home basis as it is on a regular community. So I just want to bring that up. Okay, the third key reserve study result is the funding plan. So let's take a look at that. National Reserve Study Standards requires every funding plan to be based on 4 principles. First and foremost, we need to create a funding plan that provides sufficient cash to meet the association's short-term expense needs. We need to create a funding plan that has a stable contribution rate through the years. That's important because we want to offset the irregular cash flows of expenses in the reserves with ongoing, consistent contributions. That helps keep budget stability. We want to create a funding plan that is evenly distributed across the ownership base, meaning it's a plan that's fair to current and future owners. We're not keeping assessments low now with the expectation that future owners are going to take care of the obligations. And finally, we need to create a funding plan that is fiscally safe and responsible. So while we're on the subject of funding plans, I want to take a moment to talk about reserve funding objectives. When I first started in the industry, a couple decades ago now, all the talk about reserves were about the funding method, like cash flow, a straight line, which is better, which is more appropriate. That's just a method of achieving our goal. So let's not worry about methods. Let's talk about goals. What do we want to achieve with our reserves? So how strong do you want your reserve fund to be? How tolerant is your association of special assessment risk? National Reserve Study Standards outlines 3 reserve funding objectives. There's full funding, threshold funding, and baseline funding. So which do you choose? Full funding is the most conservative objective, which means it has the goal to reach and remain at 100% funded. Baseline funding is the opposite extreme, which means it has the goal to just barely remain cash positive through the years. Threshold funding is a strategic choice of a particular percent funded target somewhere between the full and baseline funding objectives. So this is a percent funded graph illustrating a full funding profile. When I'm creating a funding plan, this is primarily what I'm looking at when I'm crafting, annual increases, setting the contribution rate, and it has, like I said, the long-term goal to achieve 100% funded. Now, I don't have some arbitrary timeline in mind trying to get the association from where it's at to 100% funded within a short period of time. In this example, the association is starting at 55% funded. But notice it takes 21 years to actually achieve the goal. What I want to see in creating a funding plan like this is a nice long-term uptrend that's going to eventually achieve that goal within that 30-year window projection that we're providing. So again, I think this is a good plan. And the big criticism of full funding is that people believe it's overly conservative, it charges the ownership too much, it's too aggressive. But like I said, this takes 21 years to achieve. Now, just opposite of full funding objective is the baseline funding objective. This is the same data, the same community set, starting at 55% funded, but we've slightly reduced the contribution rate to illustrate pursuing a baseline funding objective. Now keep in mind, it still takes some pretty significant reserve contributions to keep reserves from going below zero. Now, although the goal is just to barely remain cash positive, a baseline funding objective is still supposed to provide adequate funding so that reserve projects can get completed on time. It's not building in deferred maintenance and delays. But notice by following this objective, there's about 9 years in there where the association falls into that weak, high-risk range. Now, if you recall from our discussion on percent funded, that any time an association is in this range, they have a better than 1 in 3 chance of needing a special assessment due to the lack of sufficient reserve funds. This association is likely going to have about 3 special assessments scattered through those years. So what we found on average is that reserve contributions required to achieve a full funding objective are about 10 to 15% more than contributions required for a baseline funding objective. Full funding does not require 2 to 3 times the contribution rate as a baseline funding plan, as many might believe. What I find is a lot of communities out there aren't even contributing enough to achieve a baseline funding objective, so then when they're faced with a recommendation for full funding, it just seems unachievable. One of the biggest misconceptions about reserve funding is that it's for the future and it only benefits the future owners. But that's just incorrect thinking. Contributions to the reserves are offsetting current asset deterioration that is occurring while the current owners are living here and using or having access to those assets. So the owners using those assets should be paying their fair share of the asset deterioration. And if everybody pays their fair share for the amount of time they live in the community, then the future takes care of itself. Reserve funding and reserve contributions are not charity for some future group of owners. I've got a couple of frequently asked questions I'm going to go through quickly, and then we'll open it up to some questions. We're often asked, what types of reserve studies are there? There's 3 main types. You have a full reserve study, and this is a first-time reserve study where the component list is created from scratch. This is the most time-consuming and comprehensive option. But once you have a good study in place or a good set of data, you don't need to do a full reserve study again. The WSV is what we refer to as an update with site visit reserve study. And this is where that component list is updated based on both visual observation by going back through the community and looking at everything, and information provided by the client in terms of what projects have been completed since the last study was done. The NSV is an update no site visit reserve study, again, where the component list is updated from a prior reserve study based solely on the information provided by the client about projects that have been completed. There is no on-site review of the assets. Then how often should you update the reserve study? The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and Generally Accepted Accounting Principles recommend annual review or update of the reserve study as part of the budget planning and reporting process. CC&Rs and state laws may also provide some timing guidance. Some states, such as California and Washington, require annual reserve study updates and disclosures. Your CC&Rs, if they happen to reference a reserve study, will often require a reserve study update about every 5 years. That's what I've seen typically. But honestly, every 5 years is too infrequent. There's too much turnover in the board and management, and a lot of information is lost. So really, 5 years should not be an option. It's generally recommended in the reserve study industry to conduct an on-site inspection or an on-site update every 3 years with consideration for the no-site visit updates during the in-between years. So in closing, I'd like to reference our website, reservestudy.com. If anybody's interested in learning more about reserve studies, we have a big library of frequently asked questions. We have articles. We also have webinars. Our company hosts live webinars about quarterly. If you're not able to make a live webinar, we have recordings of past webinars that you can watch anytime on your own. And a lot of those webinars are co-hosted with other association industry professionals such as accountants, attorneys, and insurance people talking about association business. So there's definitely some good information there if you're interested in digging a little deeper and learning more about reserve studies. So that concludes my presentation. So at this point, we can open it up for questions.